Throughout the entire 375-episode history of this program, we have striven to elevate one core principle above all others, and that is that we always call things what they are, even, and especially, when it's something the audience might not necessarily want to hear. I'm not going to call this a trigger warning because, frankly, if you were the type of person who requires trigger warnings, you wouldn't be watching this channel in the first place. But there will undoubtedly be those among you for whom what I am about to say will hit rather uncomfortably close to home. And if you get offended by it, tough. That's your problem. I don't apologize. Because it's like I have been telling my kids all their lives. No one can cause you offense. Being offended is a choice that you make for yourself. If someone says a thing and you get your knickers in a twist over it, you have chosen to impute that person with that power over you. And I think that's just about long enough of a disclaimer, so let's get down to the brass tacks, shall we? Here it comes. If you give the slightest inkling of a good goddamn about this stupid Republican debate that's happening this week, stop. Because you are part of the problem. Why are you part of the problem? Well, I want you to take a look at the nearest calendar. Because it is currently August of 2023. The presidential election is in November of 2024. 15 months from now, in other words. 445 days, if you want to put it in even starker terms. And if you've been following American politics longer than 5 minutes, there's something you already know about presidential elections. And that is that nothing ever happens in a non-election year in a debate that makes a single damn bit of difference in what winds up happening in the election itself. The only thing that ever happens the year before the election is that some of the candidates wind up slitting their own throats, shooting themselves in the foot, kicking themselves in the balls, pick whichever metaphor you prefer, and they wind up having to drop out of the race before the election year ever arrives, just like we were talking about last week with Gary Hart and Joe Biden. Back in 1987, one guy got exposed as a philanderer, the other guy got exposed as a serial plagiarist who lies about pretty much every single detail of his entire life. And for Joe Biden, that's a regrettable habit that only has gotten worse instead of better as the decades have gone on. At least, that's what Corn Pop and Nelson Mandela told me. But when those guys had to drop out of the race, it wasn't because of anything somebody said in a debate. In 1987, it would have seemed completely absurd to everyone, Democrat, Republican, and otherwise, to be having debates when it's still the summer of the year before the election year, because it is completely absurd. And sure, sometimes these things provide a couple moments that make for some interesting television, something mildly entertaining, especially in 2016 with Trump on the stage. I'm not going to pretend I didn't find that stuff amusing. But did it have the slightest bit of bearing on who wound up with the nomination or who wound up in the White House? No, it did not. Everybody complains all the time, correctly, about the fact that we don't seem to have any non-election season anymore. We just sort of drift from one election season directly into the next one. And who made things that way? Well, we did. By paying attention to debates that happened 15 months before the damn election. By tuning in and giving ratings to the fake news sludge factories that produce the freaking things. By listening to radio hosts and podcasters who drone on for hours and hours about debates and poll numbers when we are so far out from the election that you've almost still got time to knock up your wife, get the baby delivered, then knock her up again and get that baby delivered before it's time to actually go to the polls. By paying attention to this garbage, you give a lot of people exactly what they want. You contribute to the continuation of the 150-year stranglehold that these two corrupt idiot parties have had on the political life of your country. You contribute to the survival of legacy media fake news organizations that ought to have died at least 20 years ago. Here's a news flash. Not one single person on that debate stage tomorrow is ever going to be the president. And in their heart of hearts, they all know it. For some of them, they're hoping to position themselves to maybe be Trump's running mate. For others, and I'm looking at you, Hutchinson and Christie, they just want their faces on television and they are willing to say and do absolutely anything if that reward is potentially in the cards. Those two jackasses in particular are so in love with the red light on the TV camera, it would even make Tony Fauci blush. All they want from life is to spend the next Trump administration as trained SEAL CNN contributors who get trotted out to read lines off a teleprompter about how very, very awful the bad orange president is. But we are going to talk about debates tonight, and if that makes the host a hypocritical bastard, I guess that's fine. Because it just so happens that today, or yesterday by the time you're watching this, is the 165th anniversary of the first Lincoln-Douglas debate, and there is much about the story of those debates that serves as an illustration of just how brain-dead and ignorant and intellectually benighted we are compared to the people who lived in Illinois in 1858. Jim Eagle, hit the music. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where this latest natural disaster was much like all previous natural disasters in that we skated through it with nary a scratch and LA got reduced to even more of a dystopian hellscape than it was already. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America and all ships at sea. Welcome to the program. I am your eponymous host and humble servant. And I think it's safe to say, in the abstract at least, that most everybody knows a little something about the Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858. But as with most historical events, there are still rather a lot of misconceptions about it. And much of that, I think, has to do with the fact that for the only time in history, the 1860 presidential election was a rematch of the 1858 Illinois Senate election. So a lot of people incorrectly assume that the Lincoln-Douglas debates were part of a presidential race and not a Senate race. And even for people who do understand that these debates were for a Senate race and not for the presidency, many of them don't realize that the people in the audience watching said debates, they didn't even have a vote. Because the wretched, god-awful 17th Amendment doesn't happen until 1913. So when Lincoln and Douglas face off against each other in 1858, the only people doing the voting are the 100 members of the Illinois General Assembly. But there was still something to gain for each candidate in making a direct appeal to the public, because if there were two guys up for a Senate seat and the people had a clear preference for one of them or the other, well, they would express that preference by writing to their local assembly member and saying, look, if you want to count on my vote the next time you come up for re-election, well, I think you should support my preferred candidate for this Senate election. There were 7 Lincoln-Douglas debates in 1858. They held one in each of Illinois' 9 congressional districts, and they were really the earliest examples of what we would today call a national media event. The advent of the railroad and the telegraph meant that for the first time in world history, the two guys could have a debate in Illinois one day, and people in San Francisco and New York City and practically everywhere in between could read a verbatim transcript of the whole thing in their morning newspaper the next day, which is some mind-blowingly futuristic shit when you were living in 1858. And the candidates themselves, who obviously both had aspirations to the presidency, they knew it was a win-win situation for the both of them if they agreed to have this series of debates, and the wonders of modern technology meant that they would each develop a higher profile nationally, far beyond anything they normally would enjoy just being Senate candidates from the state of Illinois. So if you ever wondered why the 1860 presidential election was a rematch of the 1858 Illinois Senate election, well, that's why. Because Lincoln and Douglas were both savvy enough to know that the press reports on these debates, when disseminated from sea to shining sea, would give them a tremendous leg up on any of the competitors in their respective parties when it came time to vie for the presidential nomination 2 years later. And if you ever wondered how in the hell Abraham Lincoln, a former one-term congressman who had lost more elections than he'd ever won and was a member of a brand new party composed mostly of former Whig abolitionists, wound up being elected to the presidency, that's why. Because through these debates and the nationwide coverage that they received, people all over the country had the opportunity to read his words and take their measure of the man. And they very much liked what they heard. They saw a man who was quite obviously a towering intellect and an astoundingly eloquent speaker who possessed a singular moral courage and the ability to express it in a forceful and accessible way, who had a clear understanding of the peril that the country was in and a coherent plan for what the hell we ought to do about it. The 9 debates were held between 21 August and 15 October, which is to say, they weren't doing this shit a year and a half out from the election, which would have seemed absurd, because it is absurd. And they more or less worked their way from north to south as they went. The first debate was in Ottawa, Illinois, and then Freeport, then Jonesboro, then Charleston, then Gainsburg, then Quincy, and they had the last one in Alton. The format went like this, and try to imagine any current-day politician agreeing to these debate ground rules. First, there was no moderator, because what the hell do you need a moderator for? The first guy spoke for 60 minutes. Then the other guy spoke for 90 minutes. Then the first guy got to close the thing out with a 30-minute rebuttal. They took turns going first. To decide who opened the first debate, they flipped a coin. And that was it. A coin flip and a handshake. Not once did either man interrupt the other or make any sort of interjection. There were no snide remarks or funny faces or personal insults, because back then, in what was, in many respects, a far more civilized age than our own, even the most bitter of political rivals could trust each other and themselves to behave with politeness and gentility for 3 hours, because that is what gentlemen do. But there are no gentlemen in politics anymore. And these guys were arguing over far more important issues than anything that confronts us here in the third decade of the 21st century. Now, during that first debate in Ottawa on 21 August, Lincoln said the following, and a lot of people throughout the country took notice of it. Quote, "I hate indifference to slavery because of the monstrous injustice of slavery itself. I hate it because it deprives our Republican example of its influence in the world, enables the enemies of free institutions with plausibility to taunt us as hypocrites, causes the real friends of freedom to doubt our sincerity, and especially because it forces so many really good men amongst ourselves into an open war with the very fundamental principles of civil liberty, criticizing the Declaration of Independence and insisting that there is no right principle of action but self-interest." Close quote. Going into the debates, Stephen Douglas had already developed a reputation, and not undeservedly, as probably the most powerful orator of the last half-century. He figured, and not without good reason, that in a contest of public speaking, there was no way he wouldn't thoroughly outshine this tall, goofy, self-conscious interloper with the squeaky, high-pitched voice. And if you were watching the debates in person, you probably would have agreed with him. Most of the people who were in attendance felt that Douglas had pretty much wiped the floor with Lincoln because he was just that much better at the art of public oration. But for the rest of the people in the country, who were consuming these debates in the form of prose on the page, they were approaching the thing from an entirely different frame of reference. Their opinions were uncolored by Douglas's masterful performance as an artist in his own element, just as they were uncolored by Lincoln staring awkwardly down at his notes and speaking barely loudly enough to be heard, where Douglas had boomed and bellowed so forcefully that he could practically be heard in the next county over. For everyone outside the town where the debate had taken place, all they had to go on were this guy's words on the page and that guy's words on the page. And they decided, a great many of them, that Abraham Lincoln, the guy with no political pedigree to speak of aside from one term in Congress, sounded an awful lot like a man who had distilled the abolitionist point of view down to its bare essence and directly connected it to the Declaration of Independence, and thus the core principles of the nation's founding, which he would continue to do right up through the Gettysburg Address, when he required only 2 minutes and 272 words to deliver the most brilliant statement on the nature, the essence, and the promise of American liberty that has ever been delivered by any man before or since. But the Lincoln of Gettysburg, the Lincoln whom we today, quite properly, revere as something close to a demigod and raise statues and monuments to, at least the ones that Antifa and BLM haven't torn down yet, that Lincoln was not yet fully formed in the fall of 1858. In fact, he was still expressing views that today we would all regard as shockingly racist. During the Charleston debate on 18 September, he said the following, in response to repeated charges from Douglas and his supporters that he, Lincoln, was in favor of race mixing and miscegenation and, horror of horrors, eventual citizenship, and full political equality for black Americans. Quote, I will say then that I am not, nor ever have been in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. That I am not, nor ever have been in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people, and I will say in addition to this, that there is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality. And inasmuch as they cannot so live, while they do remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior. And I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race. Close quote. Now, there are many in our country today, the aforementioned Antifa and BLM most prominently among them, who use passages like that one to dismiss Lincoln as just another bastard white racist who falls oh so woefully short of our enlightened 21st century standards of racial consciousness, who should have no monuments raised to his memory, whose statues should all be pulled down, whose words and deeds ought not to be passed down from generation to generation. And what a goddamn stupid way of thinking. In his own day, in his own time, Abraham Lincoln was as racially progressive as it was possible for any white man to be whose name wasn't William Lloyd Garrison or Thaddeus Stevens. And beside that, the whole premise is just plain idiotic. It's a premise that precludes and dismisses outright the ability of a man to grow and learn, to change his mind, to educate himself, to contribute to his own personal enlightenment, and in so doing, to the larger enlightenment of his nation and the wider world. By the time of his death, 7 years after the debates of 1858, 2 years after the Gettysburg Address, if Lincoln hadn't succeeded by then to the satisfaction of modern-day wokesters in living up to our current standards of racial consciousness, he was pretty damn close, and a darn sight closer than any of his contemporaries were. He certainly no longer rejected the idea of full legal and political equality for black Americans because he spent the last months of his life, when he wasn't busy trying to win the damn war, tirelessly agitating for the passage of the 13th and 14th Amendments, the contents of which were pretty antithetical to the words of Lincoln, the 1858 Senate candidate. And sure, he never outright publicly repudiated those words. He never engaged in the public acts of performative racial self-flagellation that are now expected of all white men. But by his actual deeds, could he have repudiated them any more forcefully than he did? I would submit the answer to that question is an emphatic no. Lincoln's murderer himself is on record as stating that the president's advocacy of citizenship for black Americans was the sole reason that he, Booth, decided the man needed to have a bullet put in his head. So do Lincoln's regrettable words in 1858 make him less of a martyr for justice and racial equality? No, they do not. If anything, they make him more of one. Because this was a man who redeemed himself and then used the moral authority he gained through that redemption to redeem an entire nation. And a country that no longer reveres the words and the personal moral example of President Abraham Lincoln is a country in which this reporter has no particular desire to live. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Have a great day and a pleasant tomorrow. See you next time. May the better angels of our nature guide us all upon our way. Do not comply. Get off my lawn.